the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Who is the one who is wise? Where's the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, God decided through the foolishness of our proclamation to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews, foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. Who needed the ballots? See, Josh has got them. Put your hand up and he'll bring it to you. Thank you, Josh. Once upon a time, there was a very strong young man who worked at a construction site. He was very strong, and he was very proud of his physique, and he would take his shirt off when he could so you could see his six-pack abs, and he was just really proud of how strong he was. Well, he was also a little bit of a bully. And the person that he chose to pick on was one of the older workers that had been around for a long time. His name was Morris. And he would be picking at him here and picking at him there, and Morris put up with it for a few weeks, and he finally got tired of it. And he said, "Why don't you put your money where your mouth is?" Morris went on to say, "I'll bet you a week's wages that I can haul something in this wheelbarrow over to that outbuilding over there, and you can't bring it back." The guy thought, "This is crazy. Of course I can do that." He says, You're on, old man. It's a bet. Let's see what you got to show." And so Morris reached out, and he grabbed the wheelbarrow by the handles, and then nodding to the young man, he said, "Okay, get in it." You got to think about that one for a little bit. Everybody loves a good joke, don't they? A good joke. Unless you happen to be the butt of that joke, or if it's something that makes you look foolish. I read about a man who was from a small developing country in Africa, and he had never been to a town before, let alone a city, and he had traveled with a friend of his to a city, and they sat down in a restaurant, and they both ordered tea. Now, the waitress brought a pot of boiling water, and she set that pot down, and she set the cups down and some tea bags down on the table in front of them. And so the man that had never experienced things like this before picked up the pot of hot water, and he poured the water into his teacup, and then he took the tea bag and he tore it apart, and he put the ground up tea that was in the bag, into his cup. Dumped it in there. Now, his friend who was with him gently explained to him that that's really not how tea bags are made. That in order for it to work, what you do is you put the water in there, you put the tea bag into the water, and the water will seep through it and make the tea, but then you don't have that mess in your cup or anywhere else that you have to mess with. And he thanked him for showing that. He thought that was really helpful, and that was a good idea. And so he grabbed 2 packets of sugar, and he put them in his tea. It makes sense, doesn't it? He wasn't supposed to open the tea bag, so maybe he wasn't supposed to open the sugar. He had good logic, he just had it wrong. Haven't we all done things like that? Haven't we all been foolish at one time or another? You don't have to raise your hand, but I bet we have. I've done foolish things. But what about God? Does God do foolish things? After all, God is perfect, right? I don't think anybody would argue that God is perfect. Well, according to St. Paul, that God does do something foolish. He says, in a sense, that some of God's actions might look as foolish as those who do not understand about putting unopened packets of sugar into a teacup. He wrote, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing." The message of the cross is foolishness. No, we treasure the cross. We put it in the front of our worship service. We use it thank you. In processions, when we come in at the early service, we wear it as jewelry. It's important to us. It means something to us. No, that can't be foolish. Would God make something be foolish like that? But if you think about the time that Paul was preaching, the first century AD, a cross was not a symbol like we think of it today. It was a symbol of shame. Crucifixions were reserved. Not everybody was crucified. Only slaves and enemies of the state, horrible people, were put on a cross. To hang on a cross meant that that person that was put on the cross was despised, was despicable. In fact, it was so bad, it was considered so bad, that if you were a Roman citizen, you could not be crucified. You were not allowed to crucify a Roman citizen, no matter how bad their crime was. Now, the Jewish people, they equally hated crucifixion. The Old Testament says, anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. So Jews thought that someone who was crucified was cursed by the rulers who put him there, and also cursed by God. Criminals died on the cross, not decent folks. A cross is not something that you wanted to have anything to do with. Think about it this way. If you were to walk into the sanctuary next week and you saw that I made a nice little display up here and I put an electric chair right here, and then I put a bag of injectable poison here and a container of toxic gas here, and I had a gallows that was hanging down here, and then I put a rifle up here, which are all ways that we execute in the United States, what would you think? I think you would have more to say to me than, "I think you're being foolish," I would guess. Well, that's how they thought about the cross at that time. It was not something to think highly of. They made the most despised object the most prized symbol. St. Paul said that the Jews were offended by the cross, and the Greeks said it's all nonsense. It was a huge obstacle for those first century Christians to believe. It was an obstacle for them to believe that Jesus was the Messiah in the first place, because their idea of a Messiah was going to be a mighty ruler who would come charging in on his horse and would banish the Romans and out of Jerusalem, and the Jewish people would retain control of Jerusalem. That's the Messiah they were looking for. Instead, the Messiah comes riding a donkey into the city of Jerusalem, and a week later, he's crucified on a cross between two thieves. It's no wonder the gospel sounded like foolishness to so many of those. And to the Greeks, it sounded like nonsense. You see, the Greeks prized philosophy above all things. For Greeks, the path to salvation lay along the path of wisdom. The Greeks gave us Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. And if we could learn everything there was to learn, then we are on the path to heaven. But St. Paul comes along and he says, no, you need to know just one thing. You just need to know one thing, and that's Jesus Christ and him crucified. Now, there's another thing that Paul said about the cross. The second thing is that it's foolishness to the world. It is the church that looks foolish to the world also. He said, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise, at least by human standards. Not many of you were influential. None of you came from a noble birth. But God chose the foolish things in this world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things in this world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things in this world and the despised things in this world so that no one may boast before him. Paul was simply telling the truth to the church. There were very few of them who had big, important names, very few of them who had any power, very few of them who had any wealth. And Paul was saying, look, God hasn't chosen celebrities to proclaim his word. He's chosen farmers and fishermen and tax collectors and housewives. That's how God works. Not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Not through super evangelists, but through electricians and plumbers and salespeople and teachers. That's who God depends on to get his message out. God depends on Sunday school teachers and greeters and people singing in the choir, people filling out their pledge cards, good people. God started from the bottom up. And that's still how God is working in the church today, from the bottom up, with folks like you and me. We are God's plan for saving the world. God is counting on us. God is counting on the people of his church to turn the world upside down. And so you can see why Paul said it really sounds like foolishness to everybody out there. If you ask most Christians why Christ came into the world, we'd probably respond to die on the cross for us. And that's true. He did. But there's another reason. If you look at Scripture, there's another reason Christ came into the world. It was to train an ordinary group of people to take his message to the world, to tell people about this great love that God has for all of humanity. And who is that group that he has chosen to do that? Well, we know what it was way back 2,000 years ago, but it continues today. It is the church. There are still people today who think it's foolishness that God is going to do anything significant in the world, that God would do something significant in the world. And it's a sad thing to think about, but I would guess there are people in the church who think that same way. Some people don't understand that the church is the center of God's plan. Now, I do know that silly things happen in the church. You all know that too. We've been around long enough to know that church people can be strange. Sometimes tragic things happen in churches. Sometimes we church people, we just don't act very Christ-like. But I also know this, and I think you all know it too. Some of the best people in the world are in the church. We run into them all the time. They're the people who care about their families. They care about their neighbors. They care about their communities. They care about the creation that God has blessed us with. And they care because Christ cares. And there's really only one sure way to make our community better. One way to make this city better. One way to make the world a better place. And that is to introduce everybody we know to the love of Jesus if they don't know it. You see, there's nothing else that's going to work, that's guaranteed to work. The work of the church is serious. It's important work. It's life-changing work. It's work that God is calling you and me to do. We all have a part to do in it, all of us. There is nobody who is too important to be part of God's mission. There is nobody who's too unimportant to be part of God's mission. There's nobody too old or too young or too humble or too educated or not educated enough. We all have a part to play in God's kingdom. And so the obvious question is, are we using our gifts to glorify God? Or was God just being foolish counting on us? That's a question that we have to answer individually. The cross is foolishness to those who don't understand it. Is it foolish to you? You see, God is counting on you. Say that with me. God is counting on you. God is counting on you. Turn to the person to your left. That's right. To your left. And tell them, God is counting on you. Then turn to the person on your right and say, God is counting on you. Then turn to the people around you and say, God is counting on you. Amen.